A white police officer, brimming with arrogance, stopped a black man on the road without any valid reason, showcasing clear racial bias in his actions. The confrontation quickly escalated as the officer used force, leaving the man seriously injured. What the officer didn't know was that the man he had just attacked was an undercover CIA agent, working on a secret mission to dismantle a dangerous network. Within just 30 minutes, the truth came to light, and the officer was handcuffed at the scene, to the astonishment of bystanders. The story took an even greater turn when justice was served in a special courtroom session, delivering a verdict that shocked everyone. This is not just a story about justice, but a powerful lesson about arrogance and the abuse of power. The explosive secrets behind the incident slowly came to light, leaving you glued to the edge of your seat. What happened in those 30 minutes? How was justice served so swiftly? Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more gripping and inspiring stories like this one. James Holloway gripped the steering wheel tightly, his heart pounding as the sedan glided into the unervingly quiet town of Fairview. The instructions had been clear, but he felt the weight of the mission pressing down on him. He wasn't here to admire the quaint charm of the town. He was here to dismantle a dangerous network. Failure wasn't an option. At the same moment, in the back room of the diner at the other end of town, Dominic Grayson laid out his plan to his core team. His calm but commanding voice carried an edge of danger as he detailed the logistics for an imminent shipment. Every word was calculated, each instruction laced with unspoken threats. Clara Rowe, his sharp-eyed second-in-command, listened intently, her mind already running through contingencies. She knew the risks of exposure, and Dominic's tone told her he knew them too. They had to remain invisible, and anything, or anyone, jeopardizing that needed to be eliminated. James parked the sedan outside the Fairview Inn, stepping out with deliberate movements, his leather jacket brushing against the cold metal of his concealed weapon. Inside, the innkeeper, Walter, greeted him with a forced smile. The tension was palpable, though Walter's nervous demeanor betrayed more than just the unease of meeting a stranger. James's instincts told him Walter recognized him, or at least suspected something. Without a word, James accepted the key and retreated to his room. Behind the closed door, James set up a temporary workstation. His laptop hummed softly as he reviewed the profiles of his targets. Dominic, Clara, and a handful of others, each face accompanied by notes scribbled in shorthand. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping through his fingers. The operation was already underway, he had to act swiftly. Meanwhile, Clara sat in an unmarked SUV across from the inn, watching James through tinted windows. She had already flagged his arrival as suspicious. Her instincts screamed that he wasn't a harmless drifter. In her mind, he was either a threat or an opportunity, and both required close observation. By morning, James began integrating himself into the town's rhythm. At the coffee shop, he ordered a drink, his every move measured. Locals whispered and stole glances, their unease apparent. He struck up light conversation with the barista, masking his awareness of being watched. Across the street, Clara's eyes never left him. She noted every interaction, every detail, her suspicions sharpening with each passing moment. Later that day, James ventured to the edge of town, where an abandoned warehouse loomed in eerie silence. Fresh tire tracks in the mud caught his attention, confirming his suspicions. As he approached, muffled voices reached his ears. One voice stood out, Dominic's. James stayed low, recording snippets of the conversation. Plans for a shipment that night confirmed that this was no ordinary operation. Unbeknownst to him, Clara's team had tracked his movements. Victor, one of her men, followed James at a distance, reporting back with precise updates. Clara's instructions were clear: observe but do not engage, not yet. Returning to his room, James played back the audio. The evidence was damning but incomplete. He needed more, specific names, locations, and details that would unravel the entire network. His focus was disrupted by a message flashing on his phone: "You're being watched." Across the street, a man pretended to read a newspaper, his gaze flicking toward the inn every few moments. James sighed, knowing his presence was no longer a secret. That evening, Dominic convened his team in the diner's backroom. Clara presented photos of James captured earlier that day. Her voice was low but laced with urgency as she expressed her concerns. Dominic's response was measured, his smirk betraying a sense of control. He wasn't ready to act, not until he understood who James truly was. For now, they would monitor him closely. As night fell, James prepared for what he knew was coming. His weapon was holstered, a knife tucked into his boot. He had no illusions about the danger awaiting him. The chessboard was set, the players in position, and every move counted. The night was heavy with anticipation. James Holloway moved through the shadows with a calculated calm, every step deliberate, every breath measured. He'd parked his sedan 2 streets over to avoid suspicion and now approached the warehouse on foot. The faint hum of voices inside confirmed the operation was in motion. His mind raced with possibilities, how much risk he could take without compromising everything. Inside the warehouse, Dominic Grayson stood at the center of a controlled chaos. Crates were being loaded onto unmarked trucks by a team of men who moved with practiced precision. His eyes scanned the scene, calculating timelines. Clara Rowe was by his side, her voice sharp and direct as she relayed updates to their operatives stationed around town. Her usual cool demeanor was tinged with urgency. She knew something felt off. James crouched behind a stack of discarded pallets, peering through a small gap. He noted the number of trucks, the placement of guards, and the crates being loaded. His fingers itched to reach for his camera, but instinct told him to wait. One misstep could cost him more than just the mission. Clara's phone buzzed. A text from Victor, her operative trailing James, confirmed that he'd lost sight of their target. The message left her uneasy. James was a problem she hadn't yet solved, and she hated loose ends. She glanced at Dominic, who remained focused on the task at hand, seemingly unconcerned. But Clara knew better. Dominic trusted her to handle these distractions. James shifted his position, inching closer to the warehouse entrance. He needed to hear more, to confirm the shipment's destination. The faint sound of Clara's voice carried through the night as she issued orders to her team. Her tone was clipped, her words precise. James could tell she was a strategist, someone who valued control above all else. He made a mental note to avoid crossing her path directly. Inside, Dominic's attention turned to one of the workers, who hesitated too long with a crate. His voice cut through the din, low but menacing. The worker's hands shook as he hastily corrected his mistake. Dominic's presence was a force of nature, commanding obedience without the need for overt threats. Clara watched the exchange with mild amusement, though her focus remained on the bigger picture. "We're behind schedule," she said, her words aimed at Dominic. "We need to move faster." Dominic nodded, signaling the workers to pick up the pace. He trusted Clara's judgment, but he also knew her well enough to recognize the tension in her voice. She wasn't just worried about the schedule, she was worried about the outsider. James moved closer, his ears straining to catch every word. He could hear the faint rumble of truck engines, the clinking of metal, and Clara's voice growing sharper. A sudden creak beneath his foot froze him in place. The sound was faint, but in the stillness of the night, it was enough. Clara's head snapped toward the noise. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the perimeter. She gestured to one of the guards, who immediately moved to investigate. James pressed himself against the side of the warehouse, his heart pounding. He'd underestimated her instincts. The guard's footsteps drew closer, the beam of a flashlight cutting through the darkness. James's hand hovered over the knife strapped to his thigh. He didn't want to use it, but he would if he had to. The footsteps stopped just a few feet away, the light lingering on the ground where James had stepped. The guard hesitated, then turned back toward the warehouse. Inside, Clara's unease grew. She leaned closer to Dominic, her voice low. "We need to tighten security. If he's here, we can't let him leave." Dominic's jaw tightened. "We'll deal with him when the time comes. Right now, we finish this." James exhaled quietly, his muscles still tense. He knew he'd bought himself only a small window of time. He moved silently along the edge of the warehouse, finding a better vantage point. Through a narrow opening, he spotted Clara speaking with Dominic, her expression betraying a mix of frustration and resolve. He couldn't hear their words, but their body language told him enough. They were on edge, and they were looking for him. As the final crate was loaded onto the trucks, Dominic issued a final command. The workers dispersed, some climbing into the trucks, others retreating into the shadows. Clara remained behind, her eyes scanning the perimeter one last time. James knew he had to leave before she spotted him, but his curiosity held him in place. He needed to know where the trucks were going. Victor's voice crackled over Clara's radio, reporting a potential sighting near the warehouse's south side. Clara's eyes narrowed, and she signaled 2 guards to investigate. James cursed under his breath. He couldn't risk being caught, not yet. He slipped back into the shadows, retreating the way he'd come. As James made his way back to his car, his mind raced. He'd gathered valuable intel, but it wasn't enough. He needed more details, more evidence to bring them down. The encounter had rattled him more than he cared to admit. Clara was sharp, and Dominic's control over his operation was tighter than he'd anticipated. They weren't just dangerous, they were disciplined. Clara returned to the warehouse, her frustration evident. She approached Dominic, who was reviewing a checklist. "He's here. I can feel it," she said, her voice laced with conviction. Dominic's expression darkened. "Then find him," he replied. "And make sure he doesn't leave this town alive." James reached his car and slid into the driver's seat, his mind already planning his next move. The game had escalated, and every decision from this point on carried higher stakes. He started the engine and drove off into the night, his thoughts a whirlwind of strategies and contingencies. Behind him, Clara and Dominic began tightening their net. Guards were repositioned, patrols increased, and Victor was ordered to focus all his efforts on tracking James. The hunt had begun, and both sides knew there was no turning back. Dominic's pacing came to an abrupt halt as the door to the room burst open. A guard entered, breathless, delivering the news that one of their shipments had been intercepted. The words hung heavy in the air, and Dominic's expression darkened. Clara, seated at the table, felt her stomach churn. The precision of the disruption wasn't random. Someone was systematically dismantling their operation. Dominic turned sharply, his voice cold and controlled, ordering an immediate review of all their activities. Clara knew this was more than just an inconvenience. Whoever was behind this was closing in, and they couldn't afford any more mistakes. The balance of power was shifting, and Dominic's calm demeanor only masked his growing fury. James Holloway crouched in the shadows of an abandoned building, his heart pounding as he scanned the area through binoculars. The intel he'd received from his informant had led him to this location, and he'd managed to disrupt a key transfer. But as satisfying as the small victory was, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every move he made felt like it was on borrowed time. At the same moment, Clara reviewed the latest footage from their compromised site. The realization hit her like a blow. The intruder wasn't just observing, he was operating with precision and intent, a calculated dismantling of their plans. She felt a surge of frustration. He was always one step ahead, but she vowed it wouldn't last. James's focus remained sharp as he prepared to move again. The information he'd gathered was enough to confirm the operation's scope, but not its endgame. He needed to push further, even as the risk increased. His thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps. He tensed, gripping the knife strapped to his leg. Whoever was approaching wasn't friendly. Clara and Dominic strategized relentlessly. Clara's frustration turned to determination as she proposed setting a trap. If they could anticipate the intruder's next move, they could corner him. Dominic agreed, his mind already mapping out the layers of deception they would use to lure their prey. James's instincts kept him alive as he maneuvered through the network of safe houses and abandoned sites. His actions were deliberate, leaving as little trace as possible. Yet, he couldn't ignore the pressure building with each passing hour. He knew Clara and Dominic were closing in, and the margin for error was razor-thin. The trap was set. Clara's team spread out across the perimeter of an old factory, their positions carefully chosen to funnel any intruder into a dead end. She coordinated the effort with precision, her voice steady over the radio. Dominic watched from a distance, his confidence returning as he envisioned their adversary's capture. James arrived at the factory, unaware of the ambush awaiting him. The site matched the intel he'd been given, and he began documenting everything. The crates, the equipment, the faint traces of activity, it was all here. But as he moved deeper, the uneasy feeling he'd carried with him intensified. The first sign of trouble came when he noticed the faint red light of a laser sight dancing near his feet. He froze, his mind racing. Within seconds, he heard the click of a weapon being readied. James dove behind cover as a voice shouted for him to surrender. The ambush had sprung, and he was caught in its jaws. Clara observed the scene through binoculars, satisfaction flickering in her eyes. But her triumph was short-lived. James, despite being outnumbered, moved with a skill and speed that caught her team off guard. Using the factory's layout to his advantage, he evaded capture, turning the confined space into a maze of confusion. Dominic's voice cut through the commotion as he ordered reinforcements to seal off the exits. Clara felt her frustration surge again. The intruder wasn't just surviving, he was fighting back, dismantling their carefully laid plans piece by piece. James knew the odds were against him, but he also knew the stakes. He pushed himself harder, every step calculated to create distance between him and his pursuers. The factory became a battleground, with every corner holding potential danger. Yet, amidst the chaos, James's focus never wavered. The tide began to turn when James discovered a weakness in their formation. A poorly guarded exit gave him the opening he needed. Without hesitation, he made his move, slipping through the gap and disappearing into the night. Behind him, Clara's shouts of anger echoed, her team scrambling to regroup. Dominic's fury was palpable as he assessed the aftermath. The factory, meant to be their trap, had become a testament to their adversary's resourcefulness. Clara's frustration mirrored his own, but beneath it lay a grudging respect. Their enemy wasn't just skilled, he was relentless. James didn't stop running until he was certain he wasn't being followed. His mind replayed the ambush, analyzing every detail. He'd escaped, but the close call reinforced the dangers of his mission. He couldn't afford to underestimate Clara and Dominic. They were formidable, and their resolve had only hardened. As the night deepened, both sides regrouped, their strategies evolving in response to the escalating conflict. Clara and Dominic intensified their efforts, determined to eliminate the threat. James, undeterred, prepared for the next move, knowing the battle was far from over. James Holloway's hands trembled slightly as he tightened the bandage around Rachel's arm. Her injury wasn't life-threatening, but it was a stark reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. Her labored breathing filled the silence, the tension between them thick as James's thoughts raced. The files they had retrieved were invaluable, but the cost of each step forward was mounting. He couldn't ignore the weight pressing down on him. Rachel's injury was on him, and he knew it. Rachel's voice was faint but steady as she spoke. "They'll be coming for us, won't they?" James nodded, unable to meet her gaze. He knew she was right. Clara and Dominic would not rest until they had neutralized the threat he posed. Every second they remained in one place was a risk. But leaving now would mean abandoning the chance to analyze the files fully and expose the depth of the operation. At their headquarters, Clara paced furiously. The trap had failed to capture James, but it had yielded valuable insights. Every move he made revealed more about his methods, and Clara's mind worked tirelessly to piece together the larger picture. Dominic watched her in silence, his expression a mask of calm. Where Clara's frustration was palpable, Dominic's resolve was cold and unyielding. "He's desperate," Clara said finally, her voice clipped. "We can use that against him." Dominic nodded, his focus sharp. "He's a soldier. Desperation makes them predictable. We push harder, close every door, and force him into a corner. When he has nowhere left to run, we take him." The next phase of their plan began to take shape. Clara directed their network with precision, deploying operatives to known safe houses and doubling surveillance on critical locations. Dominic's orders were clear: escalate pressure on anyone connected to James. Their strategy was ruthless, designed to exploit every weakness. James knew the noose was tightening. As he worked through the encrypted files, each revelation added to his sense of urgency. The scale of Dominic's operation was larger than he'd imagined. Weapons shipments, financial transactions, and coded messages pointed to a singular, catastrophic event. But the files were incomplete, and the missing pieces gnawed at him. Rachel's recovery was slow, but her resolve remained intact. She refused to be sidelined, insisting on helping James parse through the data. Her insights, though fragmented, proved invaluable. She recognized names and locations that James had overlooked, filling in critical gaps. The two worked in tandem, driven by a shared determination to stop Dominic. Meanwhile, Clara's efforts bore fruit. One of their informants had tracked down an old ally of James, a man named Carter. Dominic's team moved swiftly, capturing Carter and bringing him to their headquarters. Clara's interrogation was methodical, her questions calculated to extract every detail about James's plans. Carter's loyalty wavered under the weight of her relentless pressure, and Clara's confidence grew with each answer. Dominic observed the interrogation with quiet satisfaction. He admired Clara's efficiency, though he remained focused on the bigger picture. Every piece of information brought them closer to dismantling James's operation. Dominic knew they were gaining the upper hand, and his confidence was unshakable. James's progress was interrupted by a message from an unexpected source. The anonymous informant who had warned him before reached out again, this time with a dire warning. Dominic and Clara were targeting his allies, and Carter had been compromised. The message sent a chill through James. He knew what Dominic was capable of, and he couldn't afford to lose anyone else. Rachel noticed the change in James's demeanor and pressed him for answers. Reluctantly, he told her about Carter. Rachel's reaction was immediate. They had to act. But James hesitated. The files they had retrieved were crucial, and abandoning their work now could mean losing their only chance to expose Dominic's plans. The weight of the decision was crushing. Clara and Dominic continued to tighten their grip. With Carter's cooperation, they uncovered details about James's safe houses and routines. Clara's satisfaction grew as the net closed in. Dominic, however, remained cautious. He recognized James's resourcefulness and knew better than to underestimate him. Their next move had to be decisive. James made his choice. He and Rachel would attempt to rescue Carter, but they couldn't afford to do so recklessly. James devised a plan, relying on misdirection and speed to infiltrate Dominic's headquarters. The risk was enormous, but the alternative was unthinkable. Rachel's injury made her involvement dangerous, but she refused to be left behind. The rescue mission unfolded with relentless intensity. James and Rachel navigated the heavily guarded facility, their every move calculated to avoid detection. The tension was suffocating, each step forward fraught with danger. When they finally reached Carter, they found him battered but alive. The relief was short-lived as alarms blared, signaling their presence. Clara and Dominic responded immediately, their operatives moving to intercept the intruders. The ensuing clash was chaotic and brutal. James fought with a ferocity born of desperation, every action driven by the need to protect Rachel and Carter. Clara's commands rang out over the chaos, her frustration mounting as James evaded capture once again. Dominic watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of determination. He recognized the stakes had shifted. James wasn't just a threat to their operation, he was a personal challenge, a test of Dominic's control and strategy. He vowed to end it, no matter the cost. James, Rachel, and Carter escaped, but the cost was steep. Rachel's injury worsened, and Carter's spirit was fractured. The group regrouped at a new safe house, their resolve shaken but intact. James knew they couldn't afford to rest. The files, the rescue, and the sacrifices had brought them closer to the truth, but the battle was far from over. Clara and Dominic regrouped, their focus sharper than ever. Clara's frustration was tempered by a grudging respect for James's resilience. Dominic, however, saw only the opportunity to crush his adversary. He doubled down on their efforts, preparing for the final confrontation. Both sides knew the endgame was approaching, and neither would back down. James Holloway stood over the makeshift table, his hands braced against the worn surface as he stared at the scattered documents and maps. The tension in the room was suffocating. Rachel sat on the edge of a battered chair, her face pale and drawn but her resolve unshaken. Carter, though visibly shaken from his ordeal, leaned against the wall, arms crossed tightly as if trying to shield himself from the weight of their situation. The pieces were coming together, but the picture they painted was nothing short of catastrophic. Dominic's network wasn't just operating in Fairview, it was the epicenter of a much larger global threat. The files James had decrypted revealed plans for coordinated strikes, each one calculated to destabilize key regions. The stakes had never been higher. Rachel's voice cut through the tense silence. "They'll know we're regrouping. We don't have time to wait." James nodded, his jaw tightening. He knew she was right. Dominic and Clara wouldn't stop until they had neutralized him and anyone who stood with him. Every second they hesitated was a second closer to their enemy's victory. But rushing in without a plan was just as dangerous. Across town, Clara's frustration simmered beneath her composed exterior. She stood in the center of a high-tech operations room, monitors displaying live feeds from various locations. Dominic observed silently from a corner, his gaze cold and calculating. Clara reviewed the latest intelligence reports, her mind racing to anticipate James's next move. "He's desperate," Clara said, her voice clipped. "But desperation makes him dangerous. We need to keep tightening the noose." Dominic's lips curled into a faint smile. "Let him run. The more he moves, the more predictable he becomes. And when the moment is right, we strike." Clara's eyes narrowed. She admired Dominic's confidence but couldn't shake the nagging feeling that James was slipping through their fingers. She doubled down on her directives, deploying additional teams to monitor key sites. If James wanted to fight, he'd have to do it on their terms. Back at the safe house, James and Rachel worked tirelessly to refine their strategy. The data pointed to a central hub, a facility hidden in the industrial outskirts of the city. It was heavily guarded, but it was also the heart of Dominic's operation. If they could infiltrate it, they might have a chance to disrupt the network permanently. Carter's voice broke the tension. "You're not seriously thinking about going in there. It's suicide." James turned to him, his expression hard. "It's the only way. If we don't stop this now, more people will die. We don't have the luxury of playing it safe." Carter looked away, his fear palpable. But Rachel stepped forward, her voice steady. "Then we do it together. No one's walking into this alone." The plan came together quickly. James would lead the infiltration, using the intel they'd gathered to navigate the facility. Rachel would handle communications and provide remote support, while Carter, though reluctant, agreed to monitor from a nearby vantage point. As night fell, the trio set out, their nerves raw but their determination unwavering. James's heart pounded as they approached the facility, its imposing structure looming against the dark sky. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him, but he pushed it aside. There was no room for doubt. Inside the facility, Dominic and Clara reviewed their latest reports. The increased security measures had yielded results, but Dominic's patience was wearing thin. He could sense that James was close, and the anticipation gnawed at him. "We've got movement on the perimeter," a technician reported. Clara and Dominic exchanged a glance. Clara's lips tightened into a grim line. "He's here." Dominic's smile returned, colder this time. "Good. Let's end this." James moved through the shadows with practiced precision, his every step calculated. The facility was a labyrinth of corridors and security checkpoints, but he navigated it with the help of Rachel's guidance. Her voice crackled over the earpiece, steady and reassuring despite the tension. "You've got 2 guards ahead," Rachel said. "Take the left corridor." James followed her instructions, his movements fluid and deliberate. Each encounter was a test of his resolve, the stakes climbing higher with every passing moment. Behind him, Carter watched from his vantage point, his binoculars fixed on the facility's exterior. He'd never felt so helpless, his heart pounding with every sound that echoed through the earpiece. Inside the control room, Clara monitored the feeds, her frustration growing. James was slipping through their defenses, and the realization stung. She barked orders to her team, her voice sharp and unyielding. "Cut him off," she demanded. "I want every exit sealed." Dominic remained calm, his gaze fixed on the monitors. He could see the cracks forming in their defenses, but he also saw the opportunity. James's confidence was his greatest asset, but it could also be his downfall. Dominic leaned closer to Clara, his voice low. "Let him get deeper," Dominic said. "The closer he is to the core, the fewer options he has." James reached the heart of the facility, a control room brimming with monitors and servers. The scale of the operation was staggering, and for a moment, he felt a flicker of doubt. But Rachel's voice grounded him. "You're there," she said. "Get what you need and get out." As James worked to extract the data, alarms blared, and the facility erupted into chaos. Clara's teams moved swiftly, converging on James's location. The tension reached a breaking point as James fought to complete his mission while evading capture. Dominic watched the chaos unfold with grim satisfaction. He'd anticipated this moment, and now it was time to act. He ordered his operatives to corner James, their movements precise and unrelenting. James's escape was a blur of motion and adrenaline. Every step was a battle, every turn a gamble. Rachel's voice urged him forward, her own fear evident but her determination unyielding. Carter, watching from his vantage point, could barely breathe as he saw James emerge from the facility, pursued by a wave of armed operatives. The trio regrouped in the shadows, their breaths ragged but their spirits unbroken. They'd succeeded in retrieving the data, but the cost was clear. Dominic and Clara would stop at nothing to finish what they'd started. The endgame was in sight, and both sides prepared for the final confrontation, knowing that only one would emerge victorious. James Holloway stood at the edge of the compound's perimeter, his muscles coiled with tension. The files he had secured revealed the full scale of Dominic's operation, painting a grim picture of devastation if the plan succeeded. This was it, the final chance to stop Dominic's network before their actions spiraled into catastrophe. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on James, but he pushed it aside. There was no room for doubt now. Rachel and Carter flanked him, each carrying their own fears and determination. Rachel, still recovering from her injury, showed no signs of hesitation, her sharp eyes scanning for any threat. Carter's hands trembled as he gripped his weapon, but his resolve to see the mission through shone through his fear. James led the way, every step calculated, every movement a deliberate choice to avoid detection. Inside the compound, Dominic observed the live security feeds with a calm exterior that belied the mounting pressure he felt. Clara stood beside him, her frustration simmering beneath her cold demeanor. They had anticipated this moment, and every resource was deployed to ensure James would not leave the compound alive. Clara's voice cut through the tension as she issued precise orders, directing guards to fortify key positions. Dominic's confidence remained unshaken. He understood James's methods now, had studied every move, every tactic. He believed he had predicted the outcome. As James's team breached the outer defenses, the alarms blared, and chaos erupted within the compound. Clara's frustration flared as she watched the intruders cut through their initial defenses with precision. Her sharp commands echoed in the control room, trying to maintain order amid the unfolding crisis. James led his team deeper into the labyrinthine corridors, his heart pounding but his focus unbroken. Each corner brought another challenge, another wave of armed guards determined to stop them. Rachel's voice crackled over the earpiece, guiding him through the maze with an unwavering steadiness that kept him anchored. Carter moved with growing confidence, his fear transforming into a desperate determination to protect his team. Clara's frustration boiled over as James continued to evade their traps. She demanded that every exit be sealed, her mind racing to outmaneuver him. Dominic, however, remained composed. He allowed James to press forward, knowing that the deeper he went, the fewer options he would have to escape. Dominic's calculated patience unnerved Clara, but she followed his lead, redirecting her efforts to close off every possible escape route. James reached the central control room, his breaths ragged but his determination unyielding. The room was a maze of monitors and terminals, the heart of Dominic's operation. He scanned the space quickly, his instincts guiding him as he began extracting critical data from the system. Rachel's voice in his ear urged him to hurry, her own tension rising as the seconds ticked by. Dominic and Clara watched from a hidden vantage point, their expressions a mix of anticipation and grim resolve. Dominic knew the time had come to confront James directly. He signaled for the guards to fall back, creating an opening for James to reach the core of their operation. Clara hesitated, her instincts warning her against allowing James to get any closer. Dominic dismissed her concerns with a sharp glance, confident that he had control of the situation. The confrontation was inevitable. James turned to find Dominic and Clara entering the room, their presence commanding even amidst the chaos. James raised his weapon, his voice steady as he declared that their operation was over. Dominic's smirk deepened, his voice calm and mocking as he dismissed James's claims. Dominic pointed out that James's efforts were a small dent in a much larger machine, one that couldn't be dismantled so easily. James's resolve hardened. He refused to be drawn into Dominic's mind games, focusing instead on the mission. Clara's hand hovered near her weapon, her eyes locked on James as she waited for the perfect moment to act. The tension in the room crackled like a live wire, every second stretched taut with unspoken threats. The fight erupted in a blur of motion. James moved with precision and ferocity, his training and determination driving him forward. Dominic's confidence faltered as James's resolve proved unyielding. Clara fought with calculated efficiency, her every move an attempt to outmaneuver James. The room became a battlefield, the clash of wills as intense as the physical struggle. Carter and Rachel provided critical support, their efforts allowing James to gain the upper hand. Carter, despite his earlier hesitation, found his courage in the heat of the moment, protecting their flank with unwavering determination. Rachel's sharp mind and quick reflexes turned the tide in their favor, her guidance ensuring they avoided Dominic's final traps. The dust settled, and James stood over Dominic, his weapon trained on the man who had orchestrated so much destruction. Clara lay unconscious nearby, her plans shattered. Dominic's expression remained defiant, even in defeat. He taunted James, claiming that his efforts were futile against the vast network still in place. James's voice was steady but cold as he rejected Dominic's claims. He promised to dismantle every piece of the operation, no matter how long it took. Dominic's smirk faltered as James's determination cut through his bravado. For the first time, Dominic realized that he had underestimated his opponent. The mission ended with Dominic's capture, but the cost weighed heavily on James and his team. As they emerged from the compound, the weight of their victory settled over them. They had stopped Dominic's operation, but the scars of the battle were evident. Rachel's injury, Carter's shaken resolve, and James's own exhaustion were reminders of the sacrifices they had made. Even as they walked away, James knew the fight wasn't truly over. Dominic's words lingered in his mind, a reminder of the battles yet to come. But for now, they had won. And for the first time in what felt like forever, James allowed himself a moment of quiet resolve, knowing that they had made a difference.